At 6:30 on May 10, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig stood at the edge of a jungle clearing on Mindanao, watching columns of American and Filipino soldiers march toward Japanese prison camps. 78,000 men surrendering, their faces pale and resigned. Fertig was 41 years old, a mining engineer from Colorado, 6 years in the Philippines building roads and bridges for mining companies. Now, the Japanese had landed with overwhelming force. General William Sharp had just signed the surrender order for all American forces on the island. Every soldier was expected to lay down his weapons and report to the nearest garrison. Those who refused, hunted down, executed. Fertig knew what surrender meant. The news of the Bataan Death March had already traveled through the bamboo telegraph. Thousands of American and Filipino prisoners dead, bayonet, buried alive, beheaded. The Japanese were not taking prisoners, they were taking slaves. Fertig watched the last column disappear down the muddy road. He had a choice: walk into a Japanese prison camp and probably die, or walk into the jungle and be hunted. He turned and stepped into the jungle. Mindanao was a vast, untamed land, 36,000 square miles of mountains, rainforest, and swamp, larger than the state of Indiana. The Japanese controlled the coastal cities and major roads, but the interior was a different world. Tribal villages scattered across volcanic highlands, Muslim communities in the south who had been resisting foreign invaders for centuries, Christian Filipino farmers who despised the occupation, and somewhere in those mountains, other Americans who had also refused to surrender. Fertig had no weapons, no radio, no food, no money, no soldiers, only his engineering mind and 6 years of experience with the Filipino people. The Japanese had 50,000 troops on Mindanao, controlling ports, airfields, and cities. Their policy for guerrillas was simple: capture and public execution, often by beheading or burning alive. The first weeks in the jungle were hell. Fertig fell ill with malaria, hiding in the camp of an old American settler, Jacob Dacher, a man who had lived in the Philippines since the Spanish-American War. Fertig watched Japanese columns pass below, saw Filipino civilians beaten for refusing to bow, and witnessed a country crushed under occupation. Yet, in the midst of despair, a thought took root. What if the scattered Americans in the jungle could be organized? What if the Filipino resistance could unite under a single command? What if an army could rise from nothing, in enemy territory, without supplies or weapons? It was insane. Fertig knew it, but in July 1942, he made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or get him executed. The first problem was rank. In the Philippines, military authority was everything. Filipino soldiers would not follow a lieutenant colonel when other colonels were scattered across the island. Fertig did something extraordinary. He found a Filipino metalsmith to fashion 2 silver stars from old coins. Wendell Fertig, mining engineer from Colorado, promoted himself to brigadier general. By September 12, 1942, he declared himself commander of all American forces on Mindanao, and became the most wanted man on an island occupied by 50,000 Japanese soldiers. But legitimacy wasn't the only challenge. The Filipino resistance fighters were fragmented: former soldiers, civilian volunteers, even bandits. They fought each other as much as the Japanese. Fertig found his first real ally in Luis Morgan, a Filipino constabulary captain, half American, half Filipino. Morgan understood the key: the guerrillas would never unite under a Filipino commander. But they might unite under an American who symbolized hope, the promise of MacArthur's return. Morgan agreed to serve as Fertig's executive officer. Fertig became the face of the resistance, the American general hiding in the mountains. Yet, Mindanao was not one island. The North was home to Christian Filipinos educated in American schools. The South and West were Moro lands, Muslims resistant to outsiders for centuries. The highlands held pagan tribes who had never been conquered. Each group spoke its own language, had its own customs, and its own grudges. The Japanese exploited these divisions, recruiting collaborators, spreading rumors that Americans had abandoned the Philippines forever, paying informants to betray guerrillas. Fertig had no way to contact Australia, no radio, no supplies. His guerrillas fought with ancient rifles, homemade shotguns, and buolo knives. In late 1942, Fertig found Placido Alendras, a Filipino engineer who had worked in mining. Alendras believed he could build a radio transmitter from salvaged parts. Weeks of scavenging, copper wires from wrecked trucks, vacuum tubes hidden by civilians, a generator from a small gasoline engine, culminated in a transmitter hidden in the jungle. In February 1943, the first message was sent to MacArthur. 3 weeks later, a faint reply came from Australia. Verification questions followed, personal details only Fertig could know. The Americans believed him. Support was conditional, but Fertig's position as general among Filipinos was secured. By March 1943, a U.S. Navy submarine, the USS Tambor, arrived to evaluate Fertig's operation. The intelligence officer aboard was stunned. Fertig had created an organized force from nothing. Scattered guerrilla bands were unified, Filipino officers trained, intelligence networks established in occupied cities, coast watcher posts reporting enemy ship movements. All operating under the noses of tens of thousands of Japanese troops. Submarines began arriving regularly with supplies, rifles, ammunition, radios, medicine. Fertig organized distribution networks, moving supplies through hidden beaches, jungle trails, and rivers. His army was growing, his organization becoming a force the Japanese could neither find nor crush. Japanese intelligence responded with brutal offensives in May 1943. Thousands of troops swept through the northern provinces. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were burned, civilians massacred. But Fertig had anticipated this. His forces scattered into the jungle, abandoning camps and supply caches. Japanese columns found empty trails, cold fire pits, nothing but shadows. Ambushes struck patrols at night. After 6 weeks, the offensive collapsed. Malaria, dysentery, and demoralization forced the Japanese to withdraw. Fertig's guerrillas returned, stronger than ever. Repeated offensives, in October 1943 and early 1944, met the same result. Japanese commanders realized the impossible. They were fighting an entire population. Every farmer could be a spy. Every village a supply depot. By mid-1944, Fertig commanded over 30,000 armed guerrillas. His forces were no longer simply soldiers, they were a nation. Farmers carried ammunition in the morning and tended crops in the afternoon. Fishermen moved supplies by night, sold fish by day. Fertig had even established a civil government. Provincial governors, municipal officials, courts, schools, hospitals, and a guerrilla currency accepted by merchants. The Filipino population now had hope, justice, education, and medical care, things the Japanese could never offer. When American forces landed in October 1944 on nearby islands and then on Mindanao in April 1945, they were met by Fertig's army, well-trained, uniformed, and ready. The Japanese garrison, once 50,000 strong, had been shattered and scattered. What was expected to be weeks of hard fighting became a swift liberation. Fertig's guerrillas had already cleared defenses, killed thousands of Japanese soldiers, and prepared the ground for MacArthur's return. After the war, Wendell Fertig returned to the United States in 1945. He was 54, exhausted, ravaged by malaria, but his mind already focused on the future. He helped create the U.S. Army's Special Forces and the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, the foundation of the Green Berets. Fertig never sought fame. In the Philippines, however, he was remembered as a liberator, a man who had built an army from nothing, who had preserved hope for an entire population, and who had tied down an army of 50,000 soldiers for 3 years with ingenuity, courage, and determination. Wendell Fertig's story reminds us that wars are not won solely by firepower. They are won by people who believe in a cause, trust their leaders, and fight for a future worth living. One man, an engineer from Colorado, had done what armies could not. He created a nation in the jungle and kept hope alive when hope seemed impossible.